Well, hey friends, thanks so much for joining us today from wherever you're watching from. I hope that what lies ahead is both helpful and encouraging for you as you discover what it means to trust in and follow Jesus. Now, a couple big things I just want to mention right out of the gate. Most of us are probably very much aware of the conflict that's happening in the Ukraine right now, and we certainly want to be encouraging you to be praying for the people there and that peace would come quickly. But if you're wondering, is there a way I can help beyond that? There certainly is. If you want to head over to Canadian Baptist Ministries and their website, you'll discover some links that you're able to contribute and donate towards some resources where they have some assets and resources that they're available to bring aid to the people in the middle of that conflict. And so if you want to give toward that, you can certainly do that. Again, just head over to Canadian Baptist Ministries and their website, and you can find all the information that you need there, as well as some specific things to be praying for. Now, the other big thing is something that's happened in the province of Nova Scotia this past week. Many of you are probably aware that the timeline for easing restrictions has been sped up. And so that means that as of tomorrow, this Monday, February 28th, proof of vaccination is being dropped for all non-discretionary activities. Then by the 7th, gathering sizes will increase. And then by the 21st, all restrictions are going to be lifted. Masks, gathering sizes, social distancing, all of it. And so that means, again, changes to the way that we're doing things, and we'll continue to provide updates for you about those as we roll forward. But a couple of things I'll mention today. One is that Mark is working really hard at kind of getting things together for being back in person for students and Voyagers, so keep up with him and the Facebook page for our students in order to know more information about that. As well, that means that starting this Wednesday, I think it's March the 2nd, we're going to be hosting midweek again here at the church at 6:30, so if you want to join us for a time of prayer and devotion, masks are still required for that, but for the next few weeks that will be the case, but we're going to be back into hosting that again. So join us this Wednesday. We'd love to have you here. And then finally, one last thing that's happening this week that I really would love to see you involved in is this Friday night from 5 to 7 p.m. we are hosting a drive-through supper. And so you can come by the church, you can drive through, you can pick up a bowl of seafood chowder that Bud's making or chili that Lori's making, and there's going to be rolls and desserts, and all of that is going to be a fundraiser in order to help Kaya Shearer as she heads to Montreal on a missions trip later this spring through Crandall's Claystone program. And so again, that's this Friday from 5 to 7, drive through at the church. We'd love for you to pick up supper for your whole family by donation. As we continue to move into this spring season and Easter comes up on the horizon, we're so looking forward to celebrating that together again. And so keep your ear to the ground, follow us on Facebook. That's your best way to know what's happening with things here at the church. But as always, if you want to know, feel free to send us a message through Facebook or contact me, and we'll do our best to keep you in the loop as to what's happening. Take care and have a fantastic week. Let's worship together.
I've been held in your hand from the moment after me. Your goodness is running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Sin runs deep, your grace is more. Where grace is found, Lord, there you are. And where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. So teach my song to rise to you when temptation comes my way, and when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. So teach my song to rise to you when temptation comes my way, and when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Oh God, how I need you.
In the Gospel of Luke, we read about a time where Jesus is making his way toward Jerusalem, and there is a whole crowd of people who are going there with him. And along the way, at some point, Jesus does something that he so often does. He tells a short story, a parable, in order to illustrate a particular point to his audience. Now, Luke, who carefully investigated the life of Jesus and wrote an account of the things that Jesus did, the things that Jesus taught, so that we could know who he is, Luke describes, or at least sets up this parable for us by telling us who the exact audience is. He says this in chapter 18, verse 9, that Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. Now, what Jesus has in mind is this group of people who would have paid strict adherence to religious law. In fact, they would have been very religious. They would have been people who felt justified that somehow they had pleased God by their right thinking and their right actions. But not only that, but they also treated others with contempt. They felt justified in pointing the finger at everybody else who was not like them. And Jesus has something to say about it. He says this, that two men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. Now, you can't get any further apart really on the socio-religious spectrum in that day. I mean, the Pharisees were the group of people who were considered pious. They were considered the religious elites. If anyone was faithful to following God's law, it was most likely a Pharisee. But a tax collector, on the other hand, was a sellout. He was a traitor to Rome. He betrayed even his own people, the Jews. And so we have these two people that go up to the temple to pray. And Jesus says that the Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed like this: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, that I'm not an extortioner, that I'm not unjust or an adulterer, or even like this tax collector over here. I mean, he starts his prayer and it's just oozing with this sense of self-justification. He's shooting off his mouth about how he's so much better than, and he's wrapping it in religious terms. Now, if we just kind of stop on kind of the face value of this, we just, all of us just kind of read this and it just kind of makes you sick to your stomach. At least it should. And yet, there's a piece about this that I think we would expect that behavior from other people, isn't there? I mean, don't we expect other people not to extort others? Don't we hope that people would act justly toward others, and when they don't, we call it out? Don't we hope that our spouse will be faithful and not run off with someone else? I mean, aren't those the kind of behaviors that we might even want, or expect of other people that they wouldn't do? But then he goes on and he says this, he says, and not only that, the things that I don't do, but I also fast twice a week and I give tithes of all that I get. Not only are there things I don't do, but here's the religious devotion that is true of my life. And I thank you, God, that I'm not like everybody else who's getting it wrong. But the tax collector is standing far off. He's not drawing near to the center of the temple. He's staying back, and he wouldn't even lift his eyes to heaven, but he beat his chest and he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. This tax collector, as he draws near to the temple, doesn't get too close. He can't even bring himself to look toward heaven, toward, God who he's praying to. Physically, he might even be outside of the central piece in the court of the Gentiles. He has this kind of caution in approaching God himself. And he just simply, the only things he can get out are, God, I've sinned, and I'm begging you for mercy. Jesus, in reflecting on these two people, again, it's a parable, it's a story, but he makes a comment at the end. He says, I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, the humility of this tax collector is shown in not only the physical location of where he would be within the temple arrangement, but also by the posture that he takes and the words that he speaks. And you can just tell that there's a significant difference between these two kinds of people. And this is the problem that a lot of people have with religious people. And Jesus seems to have a problem with that kind of religion too. We've found ourselves in the book of Ecclesiastes over the last few weeks, and we are now into chapter 5 in our journey through this wisdom book found in the Old Testament. And we're kind of in the middle of this 3 parts of it where we're talking about relationships and religion and riches. And the whole idea of the book of Ecclesiastes is the teacher's quest to find meaning, purpose, significance, something lasting and permanent in this life. Is it anywhere to be found? And the question we're diving into today is simply this: can our happiness and satisfaction be found in religion and religious activity? And so he begins in chapter 5, verse 1 by saying, "Guard your steps when you go into the house of God." There's this kind of initial statement about, hey, when you approach God for worship, when you approach God to pray, any time that you approach any type of religious devotion, he says, guard your steps. In other words, watch your conduct. Remember the reason why you are there. And he says specifically when you go into the house of God. Now what the teacher has in mind is the temple establishment itself in Jerusalem. It was the place where God's presence was believed to dwell. It was the center of religious activity for all Jewish people. I mean, to go to the temple to worship was kind of, it was the thing. It was the place where that all happened. And he says, when you go into that house of God, when you find yourself, walking into God's presence, be careful. Remember why you are there. Now, again, under the old covenant, the temple was the central place of worship. It's where sacrifices happened for sin. It's where annual festivals took place, including Passover, the Feast of the Harvest, like all of these kinds of things where people were expected to come to Jerusalem 3 times a year, if not more. Like there was this center of religious activity that happened that was at the temple. I mean, people went daily to pray and to petition God, to ask him to act on their behalf, or to heal their mother, or to move in somebody's heart, or to heal their marriage, like all these kinds of things. Like so the temple was the central religious hub. It was the place where all religious activity kind of circled around. And in some ways, these verses are the very reason why your grandma said, make sure when you go to church that you iron your shirt, that you be quiet, that you don't run around, because this is a place of worship. And when you go into that place, there are certain things, you got to watch your step. And so the teacher kind of gives this advice. Now, under the new covenant, things are a little bit different in this way, that the worship that we bring toward God is not centered around a specific place. In fact, in John chapter 4, we see this moment where Jesus is walking through Samaria, and he sits down at a well and he begins to talk with a woman who comes out by herself in the heat of the day, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. But as they begin to chat, Jesus begins to talk with her about her life, and some things get exposed, and she feels vulnerable, and there's this moment where Jesus is really, in terms of their conversation, they're getting to the heart of what's going on in her life, and she feels uncomfortable and she begins to deflect. And she says this in chapter 4, verse 19 of John. The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive you're a prophet, but our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that it's in Jerusalem. That's where the place that people ought to worship." So she begins to ask a question about the place of worship. Where should that happen? And she draws attention to this 400 plus year old ethnic and religious tension between Jewish people and Samaritans. Where does true worship happen? Is it at this temple or at this temple? Can you just settle that for me so we know who's right? But Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father." I mean, Jesus just simply destroys all of the categories. And he says, worship is not about a place. In fact, he goes on to say this: you worship what you do not know, and we worship what we know, for salvation is of the Jews. So there's a piece about worship that we have to pay attention to what's true and what's acceptable and what is right in the eyes of God. But then he says this. He says, the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. For God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. And so what is Jesus getting at? He's saying, look, worshiping God is not simply about religious activity. There's something more to it. It's a spiritual activity. It has to do with the posture of your heart and in accordance with what is true. So the content of that faith matters, but it's really not about the place. It's about the heart. That's what worship is. And so the author of Ecclesiastes, the teacher, says, when you go into the house of God, when you participate in that, guard your steps, recognize within your heart what is going on, and pay attention to why you are there. In fact, he goes on to say this in verse 1. He says, to draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. In other words, when you come to worship God, be attentive to God and to his word, and allow that to shape and influence your life, because that's what you are there for. He says it's better to do that, to listen to God, than to offer the sacrifice of fools. What's he talking about? He's alluding to this idea of religious behavior without transformation or without obedience. It's simply walking in and going through the motions and doing the religious activity without even paying any attention to God and his desires at all. And he says those who do that, that's the sacrifice of fools. They don't even know that they are doing evil. It's even out of ignorance, and yet they think it's pleasing to God, when in fact it is the exact opposite. Because religious activity without obedience, without actually listening to God in the process, I mean, that's what God is after, is for us to hear from him. And so in Matthew chapter 15, we have this interesting thing that takes place where Jesus is again talking with the scribes and the Pharisees. In fact, they have sent a delegation from Jerusalem to address this issue with Jesus. And they ask Jesus this question: why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders, for they do not wash their hands when they eat? Now, the Pharisees sought to help people be able to follow the law as they should, but in doing so, they created their own set of traditions and rules in order to help preserve the law. And so what ended up happening over time is that these traditions and rules that the Pharisees created that were meant to preserve the law actually became a law unto themselves. And so the Pharisees at one point see Jesus' disciples are eating lunch and they haven't washed their hands properly. And so this tradition's been given equal authority as the law of God itself, and they asked Jesus, why don't you require your disciples, if they're going to be pious and religious and do things rightly and be justified, then why aren't they washing their hands the proper way, according to the instructions that we've been given about how to wash your hands? And so Jesus responds, he says, and why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? And for God commanded, he said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles their father or mother must surely die. But you say, if anyone tells his father or mother, what you would have gained from me is given to God, he need not honor his father. So for the sake of your tradition, you have actually made void the word of God. In other words, there were people who had needy parents, and it was the responsibility of the child to look after their needy parents. But what was happening is that people had set aside the things that could have been used to help their parents and say, sorry, mom and dad, I can't help you with that. I've actually set that aside for God, for religious devotion, which, by the way, would have ended up benefiting the temple and the Pharisees themselves. I've taken this and I can't help you because I'm setting it aside for religious purposes. Jesus says to them, you hypocrites. He's setting aside the actual law of God for the sake of your tradition. He says, Isaiah spoke rightly of you when he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commands of men. Jesus essentially calls them actors, putting on a show, religious devotion without actual transformation that's taking place. And they honor with their lips, but not from their hearts. Now, the original passage that Jesus quotes from Isaiah had to do with the time when the Jewish people had actually disobeyed God by their actions. But Jesus now says, look, he takes that verse and he applies it to this moment. He says, look, there is outward action on your part, but there's no inward transformation. You honor me with your lips. You speak of me. You talk about righteousness. You sing songs, but your heart isn't in it. In fact, your devotion isn't even toward God himself. It's toward other things. Man. And so in chapter 5 of Ecclesiastes, verse 2, the teacher says, don't be rash with your mouth. Don't shoot off your mouth. Don't be quick to run your mouth or quick to speak. Don't be rash with your mouth, or let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. In other words, recognize once again who God is and who you are. God, he says, is in heaven and you are on earth. God is above the sun and you are under the sun. This is a theme through Ecclesiastes, that what meaning, purpose, and significance can be found in life under the sun, and yet we need to look above the sun for all of that. And that is where God is. And so when we look above the sun to God, we begin to get a glimpse of what's permanent and what is sure, and what brings true meaning to our lives. And so God's dwelling place here now is described not as in the temple in Jerusalem, but in heaven. And we are on earth. And the intent here is not to draw a large distance between us and God, but to communicate and to demonstrate that God has authority over all things, that he is sovereign, that he sits above it all. And so recognizing that, don't be quick to speak to God. Don't be quick to shoot off your mouth when you walk into the place of worship. For a dream, he says in verse 3, comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. It's kind of a strange thing to say. And the point that he's getting at is this, that a distracted mind that happens all day leads to being disturbed in sleep by dreams, so that there's no rest for the mind. You don't actually get a reprieve at all. You're constantly distracted through the day, and even your sleep gets disturbed. Right? And his point is this, that when you get no rest that way, he says it's similar that a fool's voice has many words. Fools simply just keep on talking even to God without listening. As he says in verse 1, it's better to listen than to offer the sacrifice of fools. Now, Jesus, again, says something very similar in Matthew chapter 6 when he talks about prayer and speaking with God. He says this in verse 7, when you pray, don't heap up empty phrases like the Gentiles do. In other words, don't go on with meaningless or vain repetition. Don't just kind of keep talking excessively to God like the Gentiles do. Now, this is non-Jewish people. This is those who participate in pagan religious rituals, right? Pagan religiosity. It's, not about about the Jewish leaders, it's about the rest of the world now. And Jesus says, look, here's something that's true in every other world religion right now, is that when people pray to their gods, they just keep repeating and repeating and repeating because they think that by their many words that they will be heard. And so in those pagan religions, kind of religious babble or consistent repetition was thought to be a way of pestering the gods and of getting their attention. And Jesus simply says, look, God knows exactly what you need before you ask him. And so you don't need to keep on running your mouth, heaping up empty phrases when you pray, because God sees and he hears and he knows. And so the author of Ecclesiastes again goes on to talk about something else that's related to prayer. But when he talks about vows, he says in verse 4, when you vow a vow to God, don't delay in paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. In other words, if you make a promise to God, then keep that promise. Now, it's interesting because so many times, and maybe you've done this before even, that when people find themselves in situations of distress, they're grasping at anything that will help get them out. And they pray, God, if you would just get me out of this, I promise I will fill in the blank. Maybe you've prayed that before. I remember a few years ago when the Chicago Cubs won the World Series, there was a church shortly after that game was won who put on their sign, for all of you who made promises this week, we've got a seat saved for you this Sunday. In other words, if you prayed and said, God, just help the Cubs to win, and I promise I'll be at church on Sunday, now's your chance to come through on your promise. And if you made a vow to God, if you promise something to him, make sure you keep it. It is better, he says, that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. You know, it's better not to make promises that you can't or don't intend to keep. He says it's better for you to not vow than to actually make a promise and not come through on it. Let not your mouth, again, lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? In other words, don't be dishonest when somebody approaches you about it, right? Don't kind of make excuses or go back on your word saying, oh, well, I didn't really mean that, or, I didn't really, I'm not able to do that right now. Like don't do that kind of thing. Don't try to peddle your way back out of it, because God will deal with your hypocrisy, and it could all be avoided by just simply not making a vow that you don't intend to keep, not making promises that you don't intend to come through on. Again, Jesus has something to say about this in Matthew chapter 5. He says, again, you've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I tell you, don't take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. In other words, there are people, again, if you've sworn that you will do something, if you've made a vow before God to people, right, what would happen in this day, and what Jesus is addressing, is that people made promises and they would leverage religious language. I swear by heaven, or I swear by earth, or I swear even by Jerusalem and the temple. I swear, and we say similar things, right? You've heard it said. People say, I swear on a Bible, or even on a stack of Bibles, if you want to kind of make sure that people know how serious you are, or over my great-great-grandmother's grave. We kind of leverage these other things as kind of a guarantee or a secure of our promise and of being good to our word, that we will stick to it. And Jesus just simply says, don't take an oath even on your head, because you can't even make one hair black or white. You don't have any control over these things. You have no authority to leverage this for the sake of your promise. And so what should we do? Jesus just simply says, let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything other than that comes from evil. In other words, don't use religious language to wrap around something that you have no intention of doing. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Let the character do the talking. Let your heart do what is right. Don't try to talk your way around or out of it. Again, religious activity without a true intent of obedience behind it. That's what this is all about? And so the teacher wraps up this section in chapter 5 this way with verse 7, for when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. In other words, when we talk so much that it busies our minds and we can't even get any rest in our sleep, when there is all of this religious activity with no real substance to it, he says it's all vanity. It's a chasing after wind. It's like a fog or a mist that you think there's some substance to it in this religious activity, and yet it simply disappears out of your hands. Why? Because there's no real substance to it. So what does he say to do? But God is the one you must fear, that we recognize who he is and who we are in relationship to him. He is in heaven and we are on earth. So we should be careful about how we measure our words. We should be careful about all the boasts we make about how right we are and how righteous we are, even to the point, especially to the point, if we begin to condemn others as a result of our own self-justification. We must not simply be about religious things, but living in the true fear of God. Because religious activity without personal transformation is simply vanity. You know, there was a rock star quite a few years ago who said this: I wanted to meet God, but you sold me religion. And isn't that really kind of the heart of what the teacher's saying here? Isn't that kind of the heart of what seems to be a consistent theme through Jesus's ministry, that religious activity without actual personal transformation is just vanity? It's just a shell. It's just something that we do that has no true meaning, purpose, or significance. In fact, in 2 Timothy chapter 3, the Apostle Paul, writing to Timothy, says this in verse 5. He's just before that said, in the last days there will come times of difficulty. And he goes on to describe what people will be like. And he says, he kind of wraps it up with this at the end. He says, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. And that's very much a description of what we've been talking about all along. There's an appearance of godliness in some, that they look the part, that they seem righteous, religious, but they're not really righteous. And he's described already earlier on in 2 Timothy, he's mentioned kind of what that looks like. It's people who are just constantly picking fights and quarreling about words. It's people who are just always caught up in some kind of controversy. It's a consistent theme and pattern through their lives. It's people who've been caught up in false teaching. And he goes on even here in verses 2 down to verse 4 to describe some of these things that become evident when we simply are about religious activity without true transformation of the heart. What happens is that we are lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. I mean, that is a sharp list. It's a list that, man, we don't want to be true of us. But if we're not careful, it can be very true of us. There's a form or an appearance of godliness because of religion that lacks substance or righteousness. It's a denial of power. There's really no true transformation of character. And Paul's encouragement or advice to Timothy is just to simply avoid such people. And so I want to ask us, when we think about our own lives and religious devotion and worship, is it contained in a category of a certain time or a certain place or a certain moment? Or is it something that is true of our whole life? Because our worship is not simply about what happens at a specific time of the week in a specific location. Oh, that's something that we do together for sure, and that's an essential part of what it means to be the church, but that's not the sum total of it. God's after our hearts. He wants to change our lives. Everything that happens outside of that is just as important. And so we don't want to just honor God with our lips, but have our hearts so far from him. And so I just ask the question, like, is your heart wrecked by the gospel, by the great love of God that he's shown toward you, that you just, like, when was the last time that you knelt before the Lord and beat your chest and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner? God, have mercy on my life. Is there a love for Jesus and all he has accomplished for you, that while you were still a sinner, that Christ died for you, that you might be reconciled to God, not so that you could just be part of a religious institution, but so that your heart could be transformed, that your life would be changed? Because listen, there's so much about religion that can be so true for us that we can just simply show up and sing the songs and give our offering and pray the prayer, and we can dress nicely and we can not run in church and climb over the pews and all that stuff. Like, we can look the part, and I'm not dogging on any of that. Like those are part of our expressions of worship to God, but if our heart's not in it, it's just simply a shell. If we participate in those activities and then we leave from that space and we roll into our week just being a keyboard warrior, and we act selfishly in our relationships with others, if we carry this air of arrogance, if we're just always discontent, we can never be pleased. It's always someone else's fault that I am in the position that I'm in. And it's always their fault about somebody else and their influence and what they're doing. If we can just simply never be pleased, or if we're just constantly at somebody else because of who they are and how we're glad that we're not like them, maybe we've missed something. Because what God is after is our hearts, that we be a people of humility, that we would be a people who would pray, God, have mercy on me, a sinner, that we recognize our own need before God, that we would take on a posture of humility, and that we would preach the gospel to ourselves, because we are a people in desperate need of a saving hope that is offered to us in Jesus. If we are content with religious activity that has no personal transformation, it's gonna simply be vanity. And we will not find meaning, purpose, and significance in life under the sun.